How's it going, everyone? So in today's video, we're basically going to be continuing what we looked at last time, which was that Chris Stussy style. We're reaching out a bit further this time round, and we're looking at his label, Up the Stuss. This label is quite a diverse label in terms of the styles that are covered. You've got everything from that kind of minimal to electro, breakbeats, all kinds of stuff that's heavily influenced by that kind of housey sound. What I've essentially done is referenced one of those tracks, and we're essentially going to be breaking down kind of how you'd maybe approach creating a track for that label. So this is what it's going to sound like. As always, I'll be including the project file, which is using just Ableton stock this time around. And to go alongside this video, I've actually dropped a preset pack, which is basically a collection of presets that are heavily inspired by this Up the Stuss label. So I'll link them down below, and without further ado, let's get into it. So up first we have the vocal. So the kind of character of the vocal is this texture. You've basically got like really kind of distinct vocals which have been very processed. So before I even put this effects chain on, I'll just play it and you'll just hear like it's been drowned in quite a lot of reverb to create these like textures that carry and almost make the original source kind of indistinguishable. I've essentially got this kind of vocal sample, which if I was to do it again from scratch, I'd basically be starting with like spoken word and then just be putting loads of reverb and delay on it and kind of resampling that. And then we've basically got this kind of effects chain with this beat repeat effect, which is quite a cool one to create these like glitchy repetitive patterns, I guess. So it's basically taking different phrases and repeating it, which almost turns it into a synth effect type sound. So basically got it on like the 8th grid, different kind of parameters there. And then it's also being followed up with a reverb, quite a large reverb. The kind of large reverb here that you'll see of like 9 seconds in terms of decay just helps it like really carry and take up that space in the mix because there's no other vocal there, so it's kind of doing that job. So that is in a nutshell the vocal. Up next we have the drums, starting with this kind of punchy kick. 4/4 patterns with the occasional kind of break style kicks as well thrown in there. So very punchy kick. I feel like I say this the same every time, but there's not really much more to it than kind of taking those classic drum machine samples and beefing them up. So we've got the kick, then we move on to the drums, got the clap. So kind of a pretty snappy clap. There's a reverb on it. And there's overdrive to basically bring it out even further. Like it's really definitive in the mix. Then you're followed up with 2 kind of snare rolls. To kind of make your groove a lot more interesting, you can introduce these kind of snare roll groovers. So you could start off with this. So kind of going for these kind of offbeat notes. There's no general rules to this. I've talked about it a few times, but just gonna get creative with where you place them. Mostly on the offbeats, like literally the kind of 16th, if you go to like 16th grid, the 16th before the kind of main beats, essentially. So that's the point where most people would probably stop, which is perfectly fine, but you could take that even further by adding another layer to bounce off it. Kind of starting to build out the groove within these early stages, within these layers, just to make them more interesting. So, get experimental with that. We go into the hats, where we've got, I think this is an 8th hat, basically playing on all the 8th notes. It's kind of just there to kind of increase the pace, but not rapidly increase the pace that your kind of 16th would do. So it's kind of there for texture, which is a bit different, I guess. You've got the open hat, the one we all know, which also has the doubles. Got the cymbal, which is basically like a ride. So you've got that cymbal, which is pretty low in volume, and it's kind of being drowned in a lot of reverb as well to really add intensity. In parts, we've also got this kind of shaker fill, which I think is just taken from a random shaker loop. It kind of works really well for this. So basically get experimental with kind of loops and different parts of loops and throw them at the end. So that's the hats, and then we've not really got much in terms of loops. So taking this kind of groovy perk loop, it almost sounds like it's got those kind of tribal elements to it. So it's kind of a top loop, it's got that percussion in it, it's got a bit of those hats as well, and we've essentially brought the transients down using that kind of transient trick. We've also done the kind of envelope trick. So basically what we've got is certain parts of that loop playing and the other elements being ducked down. So that's kind of what this one's done, I guess. It's got some nice gaps as well. So that is basically the drums. The next thing we have is the bass. This particular bass in this track is pretty interesting because it utilizes a sound that isn't really that common, at least in like the minimal kind of style, which is the Reese. So we've got this kind of wavetable patch, and I'll just go into the MIDI first. So it's a very kind of simple pattern. I find with these kind of subbier sounds, opting for that kind of simpler pattern can be a good thing, because otherwise you just muddy up your whole track. So we've got that, and it's basically just playing a pretty kind of rhythmic pattern. A lot of kind of offbeat kind of notes. So you've got that one we showed, and if I show this one, you see these new notes. So the lower notes are the lower pattern. So they're basically playing the same melody, but they've been split up into two layers. So you've basically got that kind of textured pattern, or textured sound rather. Which is playing notes that bounce off each other. It's hard to kind of give advice when it comes to like melody writing, but I'd essentially be saying to start with one pattern and then find a new sound and essentially try and write patterns that add to one another. You could even start off writing the pattern in one particular sound and then transpose it down and mute notes so they're not both playing at the same time, just to see how that works. With the sound, we are using wavetable, but basically using my own samples as custom wavetables. The kind of advantage of using custom waveforms is you get kind of certain characteristics with the sound that you'd probably not get from like the synthetic nature of stock instruments. So you can get pretty creative on that front with the kind of sounds you use, and I don't think there's any rules in terms of like what sounds you can use. You can just throw in any random one and see what happens. Like I could throw this in just as an experiment. So you get a lot of kind of characteristics of sounds that you wouldn't expect. So I've essentially got this kind of patch where the sound is mostly being made up by a kind of basic shape sine sub kind of sound, and this is just adding a bit of kind of texture. The next thing of this sound, which is quite cool, is the kind of movement of the filter. Something that's pretty good about wavetable is its kind of modulation potential, where you can essentially map different parameters to add movement to pretty much anything. So what I've essentially done is just kind of mapped the filter so it opens and closes based on that envelope. So you can basically control how quickly the filter opens up and closes using the different envelopes. So that's essentially the respaces. If you want more kind of sounds similar to this in the style of Up the Stuss, then definitely check out our latest Minimal House bass preset pack, which basically has all the kind of basses you need covering this style, and they're all made using Ableton stock, so I'll definitely recommend checking that out. For the second sound, we also have the same kind of wavetable, but this only uses that texture. So you basically got this kind of like really nice texture there. Got the frequency moving based on envelope 3 to get a really kind of plucky sound. And then we also have this envelope basically sweeping it through the kind of different states, which is what this kind of dial does. Then in terms of effects, we basically just have a reverb. So that essentially concludes the bass. The next part we have, which is essentially carrying the track and helping to fill that void that's been left by the rest, is the synths. So the first sound we've got is the synth lead. So you've essentially got this kind of pretty raw sound. It's kind of the sound that I think of when I think of the kind of default operator patch. And what it's using is this preset from operator called sine waveforms. So this was actually something I discovered recently within the kind of presets, is you've got these category called components, which essentially gives you kind of pretty raw waveforms. Some very cool kind of minimal type sounds. So I've essentially used this kind of preset, done a bit of altering down here just to shape it a bit, and we've essentially just got this kind of pattern. So it kind of works down the scale, and whenever it goes up, it always kind of falls back down as well. And then you've got the variation. So this kind of second 4 bars is always that bit easier once you've kind of nailed down the first one. So it's kind of hard for me to talk about how to write patterns because a lot of it is just in the moment experimentation, but hopefully that kind of at least tries to explain it somewhat. So we've got that kind of basic sign patch, a nice kind of melodic phrase, and then we've got an effects chain which is fairly interesting. It's got a lot of the kind of standard stuff, but it's got a lot of interesting stuff in it as well. The first interesting thing is it's got this reverb with a very large decay. The next one is something that you might not be aware of, but it's essentially the kind of using reverb and delay in parallel. The order in which you use them can kind of deliver different sounds. If you put the reverb before the delay, you get a kind of certain character where you're adding space to a sound and then that space is being prolonged. But if you add the delay before the reverb, you're kind of putting that kind of delayed signal into a space. So that's another thing to think about, is the kind of order you put these effects. The next kind of synth we have is this filter saw. So it's kind of less like acidy kind of synth. And the way I've done that is just using basic shapes. The thing that's kind of giving it that kind of movement is it's being modulated via the MIDI, and we've basically got the filter on this kind of random setting. Me playing different notes here moves the filter in a different way. So it's kind of doing this like sweep up and down based on the notes I'm playing. It's essentially getting creative with different mappings that's helping to kind of morph the sound. So we've basically got that, and we've got this kind of effects chain which is using overdrive quite a lot to basically bring out certain upper harmonics. Got a reverb because it's that kind of higher sound, and the final kind of one is an effect I don't really use too much, but it's essentially kind of emulating the kind of tones you'd get from like guitar amps, where you can alter the kind of size of the speaker, you can alter the kind of placement of the microphone. So it's basically emulating if you were to record an amp. So this pattern would be your kind of response, and this one below would be your call. And they're literally playing the same kind of phrases with different sounds. So this kind of sound is using a wavetable called Blue Monday. So I've got these two kind of Blue Monday basses, just different wavetable patches, and I'll also go to the matrix. So there's a few things happening internally within these kind of envelopes. Then we've got this, and we've got another example of the frequency responding to what notes are being played. But you've also got the kind of character of the sound, the oscillator position, modulating. So we've essentially just got these kind of patches, fairly basic effects chain with reverbs and delays. We move on to the zap, which almost performs an SFX type role, kind of like a synthy stab. So that's basically the leads. We then move on to the chord stabs. So I've basically just taken a stab sample, which is like a pad. I've shown this technique where you can use pad samples to create like minimal house chord stabs. And this is basically what it is. So a long pad but short notes. And then just a kind of simple effects chain, reverb delay, very subtle amount of sidechain. Very subtle, like you'd barely even notice it. So that's the chord. Then finally we have just a basic pad. So just a kind of pad sample. What you can do in Ableton is you can actually set up like custom looping, so you can turn loop on and you can basically control how long you want the loop to be, when you want it to start, how large you want the fades to be, to basically create something a bit more natural. So that's another kind of useful thing you can use with like granular synthesis, and I think we've just filtered it down so it's very low. It's almost kind of texture as opposed to being that full pad. So I've got that pad, which is literally only playing during the break, and then I've got this, which is also a pad, but instead of playing around with the looping with this one, we've basically just got a bunch of short notes, which doesn't really allow it to like play in the pad form. It's a layer that can be very annoying, so you have to keep it subtle. But when you don't have these kind of textures and backgrounds and stuff in the background of your track, you can kind of notice something's missing a bit. I feel like a lot of these kind of minimal tracks have some kind of texture, whether it be those kind of vocals or kind of synthy textures or SFX. Just kind of things to keep the track interesting. So that is basically the synths. So yeah, that's going to be it for this one. I hope you found it useful in learning a bit more about that Chris Stussy label up the Stuss. As always, I'm going to leave the project if you want to kind of dive into sounds further. I'll also leave our latest collection of minimal house bass presets, which were made using just Ableton stock and referenced this label extensively. As always, if you can do us a massive favour and like the video, subscribe for more, comment if there's something you want to see. I'll leave a couple of videos that I think you might like if you wish to carry on watching. But for now, I'll see you in the next one.